Now, where the ties between the United Kingdom and France happen to be at an all-time low. As the two nations are fighting over, believe it or not, the two nations, England and France, are fighting over fishing rights in a post-Brexit world. And in the latest, Britain has said that it has now summoned France's ambassador to discuss the threats that have been made against Britain and the Channel Islands. But what is this row all about? Now, France is extremely angry that some of its boats have not been allowed to fish in the British waters. After Brexit, in retaliation, it has now threatened trade disruptions from next week onwards with Britain, which include systematic customs and sanitary checks on products that are brought into France, and also a ban on landing seafood from Britain onto French territory. Extra checks could also be extended to other merchandise as well. Now, London's Brexit Minister David Frost has called France's threats as disappointing, disproportionate and also not what one would expect from a close ally such as France. He has further added that measures being threatened do not appear to be compatible with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and also the wider international law. London has said that France will, of course, get an appropriate and a calibrated response. On Wednesday, France had fined two British fishing vessels operating in the Bay of Seine. One of the two vessels was operating without a license. The Britain's Interior Minister Priti Patel called France's actions as a bit disappointing and said that Britain has met all its obligations under the trade deal.
Is this in response to the fishing trawler? So that is obviously a separate matter. But in terms of what has happened this morning, I think it's important to say, obviously, that it is disappointing, and we as a country have fulfilled all our obligations under the TCA. But at the same time, government and cross-government discussions will continue, both at Commission level, but also with counterparts within the French administration.
All right, now to give us more updates in terms of why is it that France and England, of course, have come to the brink over the issue of fishing in British waters, we're joined in by Laura McInnesher-Wood, who's joining us from London. Good morning to you, Laura. What is at the base of this conflict between England and France? Why is it that the French side has protested so drastically at this announcement that the French vessels will not be allowed to carry on fishing in British waters?
Well, it's all about access to waters around Jersey, which are some Channel Islands. They're in the English Channel, as you would expect from that name, but they sit sort of closer to France in terms of location, even though they are linked more closely with the United Kingdom. Now, as part of post-Brexit arrangements and changes to fishing licences and grants from the United Kingdom, new regulations mean that French fishing vessels will only be allowed a licence if they have historical links to those islands, that they've fished in those waters before. Now, the United Kingdom says that it has granted many French vessels these licences, around 1,700. The Environment Minister, George Eustace, said that actually the proportion of vessels that haven't been granted a licence is very small, only around 55 to 60, the Environment Secretary says. But that has infuriated French authorities, French fishermen, and so consequently they are now pushing back and taking some action about this. They want access to that water, but post-Brexit, the United Kingdom says that it's simply not for them to access.
Now, at this point of time, for people who are looking at this, from outside of Britain and France, Britain says that it will allow licenses for French ships that can in some way prove that they've actually carried out fishing in those waters before. But this is such a pretty ambiguous rule, is it not?
Well, I mean, it's up to the UK authorities to try and decide that, and also for French fishing vessels to try to prove that they have had historic links. And of course, we've seen this kind of escalation of tensions over the last year or so. It's not necessarily just happening right now. You'll remember back in May that there was a number of French fishing vessels that headed to the port of St Helier in Jersey and tried to blockade that port. Then the United Kingdom had to call on the Royal Navy to get some ships out into the seas there to try to see what was going on and open up access for Jersey's fishing vessels then. The UK says that actually a lot of this action by France is disproportionate, that two can actually play at that game. So it's going to be very interesting over the next few days, at least, to see what comes out of each of these governments in terms of discourse, what messages are sent. As far as we know now, the United Kingdom are talking to the European Commission, trying to highlight this decision by France to detain one of a British vessel, the Cornelis Gert Jan, in a port in Normandy. Why that's happened? Because the United Kingdom actually says that that vessel did have a licence, despite what French authorities are saying. They've also summoned the French ambassador here in London to come to talk to ministers to try to get his account of what France might be planning to do next. But all eyes now are on the English Channel and on what these two nations are deciding to do when it comes to access to fishing waters.
Absolutely, indeed. Access to fishing for these French boats. But the French are threatening with some pretty dire consequences. They've threatened trade disruptions from as early as next week. They've also said that they would like to include systematic customs and also sanitary checks on products that are brought to France from Britain, and also a ban on landing of seafood there. Now, these are some pretty stringent measures that France has announced. How far do you think England and France would go at each other before deciding to resolve this crisis?
That is ultimately up to ministers, but we know from this morning interviews that the Environment Secretary George Eustice has given that the English government is considering further action that they say will be proportionate. As I've said earlier, George Eustice, the Environment Secretary, said two can play at that game when it comes to threats. He wouldn't go so far as saying explicitly that he too would start looking at vessels, perhaps checking licences and detaining vessels. I don't think that that will be something that the United Kingdom will do, but obviously they are looking at upping checks perhaps. But the key thing that ministers here will want to do is try to de-escalate these tensions, try to come to some sort of talking arrangement, a talking deal, getting both sides of the story, and also going to the European Commission to try to ease this situation from a more authoritative and balanced view. The United Kingdom obviously says that it has offered the licences that it needs to in terms of UK fishing vessels having access to French waters, but obviously this is a dispute that will continue, we think, not only into next week, but perhaps beyond.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Laura Mackin-Isherwood, for joining us from London and getting this as the latest in terms of what is unfolding in this very fishy crisis between England and France. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.